Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Let's continue, inshallah, here talking about two basic types of cells. Most all cells can be divided into either these simple cells, the prokaryotic cells, or the more complicated version of cells, the eukaryotic cells. So there are two basic types of cells, the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. Essentially, all bacteria are prokaryotes. Prokaryotic cells are simple cells and comparatively smaller than the eukaryotic cells. All animal cells and plant cells are eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells have fewer organelles and are simpler in most respects. But the one defining feature of prokaryotic cell, in other words, if somebody were to ask you what is the critical key difference between the prokaryotic cells and the eukaryotic cells, is that you would have to say prokaryotic cells have few, if any, membrane-bound organelles. That's like the key defining features of these cells. They have few or any membrane-bound organelles, whatever that means. So, see, you have organs, like you have liver, you have spleen, you have the heart and lungs. Those are organs. Those are like your internal parts. Cells similarly have these internal parts. They're not called organs, they are called organelles. The word organelles meaning little organs, so to speak. So prokaryotic cells do not have these, or have very few of internal organelles like that, in small organelles. Whereas eukaryotes, they have boatloads of membrane-bound internal organelles, like these little thingies that you see over here. So they have organelles, and they're membrane-bound. In other words, each of them has a little own membrane of its own. So that is the defining feature of prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So if somebody asks, what's the difference between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, you must be able to tell the critical difference, which is eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles, and prokaryotic cells do not, or if they do, they have few or a paucity of membrane-bound organelles. That's the critical difference between these two. And if somebody asks you also, can you give me an example of a prokaryotic cells, you should readily be able to say that and say, okay, bacteria. Bacteria are like the poster child for eukaryotic cells. And as you can see over here, prokaryotic cells are typically much smaller than eukaryotic cells. And eukaryotic cells tend to be at least 10 times as large or larger than prokaryotic simple cells. Another critical differences, and this is noteworthy, and if you remember this, you appreciate some other aspects of what we're going to talk about in the future. Eukaryotic cells' DNA, their genetic material, is kind of like in spaghetti fashion inside the soup of the cell, and it's a circular DNA. I mean, it's like a big giant circular DNA which is kind of spaghettied and can roll, in the cell, kind of like that. Whereas in eukaryotes, the DNA is within the nucleus, which is a membrane-bound organ. It has a membrane, and the DNA is linear in shape. It's like a one big long strand. It's not hooked up at the two ends, making a big circle. So prokaryotic cells have circular DNA, and eukaryotic cells have linear long DNA, which is enclosed within the nucleus of the cell. And as in this picture, there are other organelles are also depicted here. So these pictures highlight some of the critical differences between these two types of cells. So here's another comparison slide here. You can see in the prokaryotic cells, the poster child for prokaryotic cells here, the bacteria. So E. coli, Salmonella, tuberculosis bacteria, etc. They are prokaryotes. And in there is like one dense area sometimes over here where the circular DNA would be. And here they're like hairy type things, the flagella that some prokaryotes have, not all of them. And all of these cells, they have cell membrane in there. You know how you would keep things together unless you don't have a cell membrane. All cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, they have a cell membrane. Animal cells and plant cells are eukaryotes. In fact, in some ways, the plant cells are more complicated than animal cells, undoubtedly. So it's interesting that you walk about, right? And then the plant cell that's right next to you, the plant, right? The cellular structure of a plant cell is more complex than the cellular structure of a human cell in many respects. Nevertheless, so plant cells, just like animal cells, they have a nucleus which contains their genetic material and various other organelles. So this is a summary of some of these features. Eukaryotic cells have nucleus, right? Very important. And the nucleus is absent in the prokaryotic cells. And usually eukaryotic organisms tend to be multicellular, but they don't have to be. Like an amoeba, for example, in a eukaryotes, like a paramecium, which is a unicellular organism, it's eukaryotes. So they don't have to be multicellular, but they're usually. Prokaryotes are usually, most of the time, are unicellular organisms. And that, as I said, the critical defining feature is that eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles. Okay? The DNA is packed with very little repetitive DNA. Bacteria, for example, have large amounts of non-coding or non-repetitive or repetitive DNA. That's not as important, I think, as to understand that prokaryotes have circular DNA that's not in the nucleus. Now, here's a general schematic of a eukaryotic cell, and I shall highlight here some of the features which we're going to talk about later in more detail. But these are some basic terms of cell organelles that we need to know. First, all cells are bounded by a cell membrane. Cell membrane is very important, and it's a very uniquely beautiful in structure, which we'll talk about in a little more detail. All cells have cell membrane. That's like the boundary of the cell that contains the meat of the cell, so to speak. And eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Okay, so a nucleus is where the DNA is. It's like the library of the genetic material. Inside the nucleus, many times you have nucleolus. Nucleus, nucleolus. So inside the nucleus is the nucleolus. Nucleolus is like the busy area of the nucleus, where the DNA is very busy, and also where the ribosomes are assembled, which we'll talk about in a second. So cell membrane, nucleus. Within the nucleus is a nucleolus. Now, vacuole. A vacuole is kind of like storage. Is kind of like a drawer, a storage bin, many times. So it's like a storage area, a cupboard. You know, it's a general term. There are different types of vacuoles. Just like in a cupboard, you can shove anything in there. Right? It's kind of. Sometimes in plants, for example, vacuoles, many times they just have water. It gives plants the turgidity. I mean, it gives them like toughness to stand up, against gravity, so to speak. When the plant is dehydrated, it wilts because it doesn't have these water in it, which is stored in the vacuoles, which you'll see. So vacuoles are storage. There are different types of vacuoles. Some of them contain food, some of them contain just water, and some of them contain enzymes. Lysosome, for example, is a type of a vacuole, and don't mess with the lysosome. Yeah, lysosome is a vacuole that degrades stuff. It's kind of like the trash compactor of the cells many times. Lysosomes, don't mess with lysosomes. It degrades things. For example, if a bacteria threatens a cell, the cell might just eat the bacteria, and then a lysosome then would combine with the bacteria and just eat it up and kill the bacteria. Now, the organelles in the cells here, they're not just kind of like hanging in thin air, so to speak. They're floating in a fluid, which is mostly water. And this fluid is called the cytoplasm. So the fluid that organelles are floating in is called the cytoplasm. These are all the terms that you need to be thoroughly familiar with. So cytoplasm. This organelle here, and that's the mitochondria, okay? That's where the glucose that you eat, the candy bar, the food that you eat goes over here, and those molecules are broken down, and you release energy from those molecules, okay? So mitochondria are extremely important because this is sometimes called the energy center of the house. It's kind of like, you know, for your house you get the electricity to run the house, so to speak. Mitochondria gives it the energy that you need. The food that you eat has molecules that contain it. You have to break down those molecules, break down the glucose, fructose, whatever, to get the energy from them. And it's the job of the mitochondria to do it. It's a powerhouse of the cell. It's an energy center, or the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, so that's the mitochondria, powerhouse. These two organs, which we'll talk about also in detail, the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus, they look like stacked pancakes, you know, like stacked waffles of pancakes. This looks more like pancakes to me. This looks like stacked waffles, you know. And we will talk about these in more detail. But they're important in protein synthesis, metabolism, and export. Yeah, so we'll talk about these in detail. These words, they sound kind of funky and complex. Endoplasmic reticulum, whatever that means, right? Like, whoa, endoplasmic reticulum, and after a while, they fall from your mouth pretty naturally. It's like endoplasmic reticulum. There are two types of endoplasmic reticulum: the smooth and the rough. But you should be very familiar with these terms. Here's another schematic of a cell, and we should kind of drill this until we get reasonably familiar with this. So here's the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, mitochondria. Here's another one. A cell typically has many, like muscle cells, for example, may have mitochondria by the thousands. And now here's the nucleus here, and within the nucleus, you see again, is the nucleolus, a little usually dark spot. Nucleus. The nucleus is surrounded by a membrane. In fact, nucleus is very curious. It has two membranes, two layers of membranes. It's so cool. It must have two layers of membranes like this. See, there's one, has two layers of membranes. It's like double coated, double sweater, you know. Someone's wearing two sweaters like that. It's like that, two layers of membranes. Like our cell membrane is like one layer, okay? There's a nuclear membrane, there's two layers membrane. It's just so cool. It must have protected DNA so well. This is a beautiful diagram, because here you can see that the endoplasmic reticulum over here, okay, endoplasmic, I told you there are two types of endoplasmic reticulum. This one is called rough. The reason it's called rough is it's got all these dots on it, see? Those dots are ribosomes. Ribosomes I'll talk about. They look like little tiny things, but that's where their action is. They synthesize proteins, those little guys. They're like the worker bees, ribosomes. They make all the proteins the cell needs from scratch, you know, from amino acids. So ribosomes are very important. If ribosomes do their work, these worker bees, so to speak, in this factory called the endoplasmic reticulum. So endoplasmic reticulum that has all the ribosomes, that's called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And endoplasmic reticulum that does not have the ribosomes is called the smooth, because it looks like smooth. It doesn't have this ribosome peppered all over it. So rough endoplasmic reticulum and smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the only difference between the two is whether or not there's ribosomes peppered on them, so to speak. And don't underestimate the ribosomes, because they are like the worker bees of the cell. They make all the proteins and stuff. Now, as I said, what's beautiful about this picture is that you can see the ribosomes is kind of like an outgrowth of the cell membrane, of the nuclear membrane. See, it kind of grows out of the nuclear membrane. It kind of grows out, but what that means actually is kind of they're connected. So the internal environment of the nucleus is connected with the internal environment of the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay. So it's kind of like the endoplasmic reticulum is like the hairdo of the nucleus. There's this kind of outgrowth of the nucleus, a bushy thing that comes out of the outgrowth of the nuclear membrane. So some of the beautiful features highlighted in this picture are that the nucleus has 2 layers of membranes, not just one layer. It has 2 layers of membrane. And endoplasmic reticulum is an outgrowth of this, is outcropping of this nuclear membrane. And notice the 2 different types of endo. Now you see then also in this picture Golgi apparatus. See, Golgi apparatus. Golgi apparatus looks to students very similar to endoplasmic reticulum, but after a while you get to kind of like see the difference. They kind of look different. Golgi apparatus is usually a more symmetrical, neat-looking thingies. And like stacked pancakes than the endoplasmic reticulum. Endoplasmic reticulum would be like the type of pancakes I would make. They'll be like messed up pancakes. But the Golgi apparatus is very similar to like in a micrograph to this. They look similar because they are similar in structure, but they have very different functions. And here you see the vacuole. And there are other tiny little vacuoles that have special jobs, which are, I'm not going to highlight this time, like peroxisome, etc. Lysosome, as I already mentioned, don't mess with the lysosomes. It breaks up stuff. Like something gets old, it goes to lysosome to die. It's like the graveyard, There are other structures over here which I have not highlighted. It's like stringy-like things, which we'll talk about in detail. Now, what are all those stringy-like things? Okay. After a brief pause, I'm going to, inshallah, talk about the cell membrane. And I don't want to rush this because it's actually very, very important concept to understand. So I want to dedicate some time to that, inshallah. So we should talk about that next time. Until then, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.